Hey guys, we're going to wrap up the topic by taking a look at some more specialty or unique techniques for sewing curved seam lines. So we have a few of these illustrated in some of our patterns. The Piccadilly Peacoat uses a technique where the facing is sewn to the lining with the right sides up. You don't sew them right sides together and then flip that seam allowance open. You sew them by layering them on top of each other from the right side, and this helps to really get a precise, clean, curved seam. We'll also take a look at sewing some simple armscyes. And I know even though in most all close patterns we're not sewing the sleeves in the round, we're sewing that seam line before we're sewing the side seam, it's still a curved seam line and it still creates challenges with just getting those seams to line up. Like I mentioned before, sometimes those seam allowances are a little bit tight. So clipping into that seam allowance before you try to spread open that curved armscye really helps to get a nice, smooth, and evenly spaced seam. So let's jump on in and take a look at some of those techniques. For this first example, I'm going to walk you through attaching the facing to the lining on the back of a jacket. So the pieces that I have cut out right here are for the Piccadilly Peacoat. This example right here is from the Armscye coat, and I'm just going to show you how that looks finished. It's a similar assembly where you have the collar, you have a facing that's made out of the jacket fabric, and then the lining is on the inside in the lining fabric. This lining has a center back seam. On the Piccadilly Peacoat, the lining does not have a center back seam. So that's the only difference, but the assembly is the same. So the challenging part with this is that the facing is cut at a curve. So you can see on this fabric right here, we have two curved pieces. Both pieces have been cut on the fold. And as I mentioned, this one's the lining fabric, this is the fashion fabric or coat fabric. So when you first cut these out, you might think there's no way this interior seam line is going to line up with this exterior seam line. It looks much longer, and even if you try to put those together, they do not line up in this method if you were going to try to attach them like this, but you're not. So what we're going to do on this example, you take the facing, and we'll begin by stay stitching a line on the seam line, which is a 1/4 inch up from this bottom edge. So what's going to happen once we do that, this will overlap the lining. So what you're going to have here is a 1/4 inch turned under and then a 1/4 inch overlap. And once you do that, your pieces will line up exactly and your shoulder seams will meet right along the seam line. So I brought this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to line this up with my 1/4 inch stitching line. I have the machine set to a basting stitch, and I'm just going to straight stitch around this curve. So I'll put my needle in the down position just so that I can turn as I sew this line. And there's that stay stitched line. Now that we have this stitch, I'm just going to clip a few notches into this seam allowance edge so that when it's pressed under, it overlaps nicely and it's not bulky or lumpy. Now I'm going to bring this over to my pressing area, and I'm simply going to press this edge under right along this stitching line. Now you can see here as these fold up, you can see how those notches help that seam allowance to have space to fold back in. So as this is flat, these notches come together. And this is how this facing looks at this point in the pattern directions. Now we're going to bring the facing back over to line up with this back lining. So as I mentioned before, you're going to take the facing and it's just going to simply overlap the top edge of the back lining. So what's going to happen is this 1/4 inch seam allowance is going to line up a 1/4 inch down from this cut edge, and then the stitching line that's marked on the pattern piece lines up with the stitching line on the facing. So if you were going to start from the shoulder, you would notice that they line up just like this. So if you were going to sew these together and not press this under, you would have a seam line that would look like this, and you'd be trying to curve this around to line up with the facing, which is a lot harder to get that to line up the same way. So this method is much easier for this type of construction. So we're going to start here and we'll pin this all the way around till it lines up with the other shoulder seam. Then I bring this back over to the sewing machine and I'm going to edge stitch this down as close to this folded edge as I can, starting at the shoulder seam and then stitching all the way around the edge of this facing back up to the other shoulder seam. And here's that finished facing sewn to the back lining. So you can see here we've used white thread, so you can see both that edge stitched or top stitched line, plus you can still see that stay stitching thread line. So because we basted this down, it's easy to remove with a seam ripper. You can just pull these threads out on this stay stitching line. That's up to you. If it's the same color as your fabric and it's not noticeable, it can stay in there and it might not show all the way around depending on how closely you press that on that line, but it is easy to remove. And then if we look at this from the back side, you can see how that lines up. So you can see that stitching line is a 1/4 inch down from the cut edge of the lining, and the seam allowance is pressed under on the facing, and this notch right here we had just at center back, just so that we could see how that lines up. So that is the interior side of the facing and the lining, and then this is the finished side. And then at this point you would just continue to follow the instructions in the pattern that you're working with. I also just wanted to show you one other quick example of this same technique used in a little bit different way. So on the mini skirt pattern that has this hook front seam line, we've done the same technique where you take the first pattern piece and you can stay stitch or just press under along this curved line, and then it's overlapped on top of the other piece. So you can see that here, and then you go ahead to attach them. You can use something like Steam a Seam or double-sided quilter's tape to hold that in place before you do your stitching, or you can just pin and then edge stitch down on this curve. But this is just a little bit different use of the same technique, and this is the skirt for the 18-inch doll, and we have that also on the littler skirt for the welly wisher size. So you can see on the inside here how that straight piece is this side, and then that overlaps with that hook front out on this side, and it's just placed on top and then stitched down from the top side. Now for this second example, we're going to move on to looking at sewing an Armscye seam. So this right here is a few steps later in the same pattern for the Piccadilly Peacoat. We have the lining connected, the front and the back, and then we have the sleeve ready to connect to the body of the jacket. So at first glance, you'll notice a similar thing as with the facing. This cut seam line looks much longer than this interior seam line. So the part that you're trying to line up is a 1/4 inch in here and a 1/4 inch in here. The standard assembly method for this would be to simply flip this over with right sides together, line up this center notch for that shoulder seam that's marked on the pattern with the shoulder seam here like this, and then you would work your way to just pin and connect this seam line to this one. And you could sew basting stitches along this top sleeve piece to give it a little bit of shape and ease that into this, but sometimes that's a little bit challenging and that creates puckers and gathers in this cap of the sleeve. So I think for this method, what I like to do is sew a row of stay stitching on your seam allowance line of the body of this jacket. So you can see right here we've done that. I try to do that a little bit brighter this time in pink. And I have this stitched a 1/4 inch in from the cut edge all the way around the Armscye. So then what I like to do on these tight curves is just cut into that seam allowance a little bit more than halfway, but not all the way to the stitching line. So you just snip into that pretty close together so that you can spread this seam allowance flat as you're attaching it to the sleeve. So I'll do that on this front inner arm curve, and then I'll do that also on this back side. And again, I'm keeping it about 1/8 of an inch away from my stitching line because I don't want this fabric to fray through the stitching, but it's enough that I can spread that seam allowance all the way open. I might also cut a few into the cap. Now when I'm ready to sew this seam line, I can pull it almost all the way straight. And then that allows me to line that up and shape it to this whole entire curve of my sleeve. So I'll just flip these over and I will match up this notch with my shoulder seam and pin that in place. And then I'm going to work my way down to this underarm seam. So I can line up the side seam first and then just fit that in along the curve. And remember, as you're sewing, you can kind of shift this, if you're sewing with the sleeve down, to line up exactly with the curve, and it will shape itself around that curve line because this seam allowance right here is split open. And then on the back side, I'll do the same thing. I'll bring the sleeve and the body here together at the side seam. We'll pin that together, and then I will work to fit this in and pin it so that the body is curved right along this sleeve line. So here you can see we have this pinned down and it is a perfect fit, the body of the jacket along this top edge of the sleeve. Now I find that if you sew with the jacket up, it allows you to make sure that you keep all of this seam allowance flat and you don't sew any folds or gathers into the body of the jacket, and it just wraps around that curve of the sleeve. So I'm bringing this fabric to the machine and I'm going to stitch this right along my stay stitched line with the body of the fabric up and the sleeve is on the bottom. Now again, you want to keep your needle in the down position and then you can just check your fabric as you go. Make sure that you're moving all of the bulk and stuff out of the way as you get in close to this seam allowance line. And here we have that sleeve seam line sewn. So this is on the sleeve side and this is on the jacket side where we stitched from this side up. So I can come in now and trim these seam allowances down quite a bit. I'll probably trim them down to about 1/8 of an inch all the way around this whole Armscye seam. And being that this is a lining, you don't need to finish the seam allowance because it will be turned to the inside of the jacket. So you can trim this down close to the seam allowance line, and then you turn this right side out and you can press your seam allowance in towards the jacket. And you can see here we have a nice clean seam line. There's no puckering, and the side seams on both sides line up with the underarm seam. So this is a standard technique or method that I use when I sew this type of seam allowance with the standard sleeve and this curved Armscye seam. I find that I get a very consistent result and I don't have any portion of the sleeve not lining up with the body of the jacket. All right, well that's it. I really hope that you guys are able to absorb most of these techniques and utilize them in some of the projects that you're working on. And of course, I want to see those finished culotte jumpsuits. So be sure to post them anywhere online. If you're posting them on Instagram or on Facebook, just use the hashtag Pixie Faire, hashtag Liberty Jane, and we'll be sure that we see those. If you're in the Sewing with Cinnamon membership group, you can share those there. We'd love to see them, and I think everybody will really enjoy seeing each other's projects and the creativity that comes from a basic design, but people can really take it and make it their own.